hey, all three of you who are here right now. It's kind of fun. I'm guessing Danny's one of them, but I don't know who the other two are. Nancy, I wondered if it might be you. Joy Fields, ooh, you have beaten out Danny in the top thing. In the top, she must not be here today. That's all I can say. Um, Hi, folks. Took me a little bit of time to start because, I always tell you that I'm not as organized as I would like to be, which is the story of my life. But I did actually have notes for today, and I left them at my house. I have to come across the harbor to broadcast, and that's a little frustrating. So I'm really not going to be organized this time, but I did jot some stuff down. We have Orlando, Florida, Newport, Rhode Island. Newport is an incredibly historic town. I know you all know that because of the cottages, the breakers and all those giant mansions in Newport. But the reason there was such money there was because it was in the early years one of the center places of the slave trade. Someday I would love to be able to write more letters about state history because I think that's really interesting. North Macedonia, like the Macedonia, that's cool. One of my favorite students came from there once. Once one of my favorite students came from there. He always came from there. Flint, Michigan, cold. It's really cold here. Susan, we were talking about you just the other day. Lovely to have you here. All right, I think we've got enough people to gather. And I always hate, as you know, to flood the zone. I feel like a little of me goes a long way. So I was not sure you wanted me to do something today. And it became very clear when I posted on Facebook that I was happy to talk today, that y'all need a pep talk. And that's what I'm here for today. So let me start with, actually, let me start not with where I was going to start, but what my reaction was to last night, to yesterday, which was, as you know, I'm broken-hearted about where our country is. I mean, all the negative stuff, but yesterday was a lot less bad than I expected it to be. And I will tell you why, but for people who read me and were like, that's it, we're done, my take on it was exactly the opposite, that this was about as good as it could have been for people who want to preserve democracy. Now, I'm not saying it's good, but I'm saying to all the people who have been writing to me and saying, that's it, our democracy is over, that's a premature assessment. Trump would like it to be over. Certainly Musk would like it to be over. But they, if that's what they were trying to do, they did not bring their game day faces yesterday. And they, of course, had years to prepare. So that says something. All right, let me start then with an easy question. And you've all asked about the fact that Trump did not put his hand on the Bible. And does that mean he is not sworn in? No, there is no requirement that you have your hand on a Bible or anything else when you take the oath of office. And in fact, it's a little bit of an odd tradition in country that separates church and state. So that what was interesting about that, though, was for me was, first of all, I liked that he did not touch the Lincoln Bible, because that was one of the Bibles that Melania Trump was holding, the First Lady was holding, but also that he is, of course, perceived by his most ardent followers as being profoundly religious, and the fact that he is the first president in a very long time who forgot to put his hand on the Bible says something right there, I think. So put that one out of your head. That has no force in meaning. It's about performance. And that's what Trump's really good at, is performance. So that was interesting that he missed it. And that, I think, is, hold that in your head, because I'm going to come back to that. All right, so another thing you're really concerned about are executive orders, and so actually I'm going to I told you I'm going to be a little disjointed because I don't have the notes I wanted, but always when you're dealing with politics or law, listen to what people do, not what they say. You can say anything, and I've been saying this since I started writing the Letters to an American in 2019. Lawmakers can say anything they want on the floor of Congress. There is no law against lying on the floor of Congress. To the contrary, there is in our Constitution protection under what's known as the speech and debate clause. So you can say anything and not get in trouble for it. And you kind of really want that, because you don't want somebody like Trump to say to Liz Cheney, I'm going to call you a traitor and have you arrested for something you said on the floor of Congress, because that becomes a very compliant Congress very quickly. So people can say anything. And similarly, you see people say things to reporters that you know are not true. And this is one of the things I kept saying about the big lie that Trump had won the 2020 presidential election. You know, Rudy Giuliani would set things up to look like he was in a courtroom. He would have, you know, the bar kind of looking thing, and he'd have people set up as if he was taking testimony. But it was a performance. It was a performance, just as if they'd been on a stage at your local high school. They could say whatever they want. There were no penalties for that. So we're going to hear a lot of people saying things for a long time now, for the next 4 years, that are not true. Now, all politicians spin. Every party, they spin. They always give you the best deal that they possibly can from the material at hand. But there's a difference between spin and flat out lies. And what we're going to be hearing a lot of is flat out lies. And so one of the things to remember is you do not have to react to every kind of lie. If I tell you right now that there are frogs raining into your car, you're probably not going to give that a lot of mental energy. And a lot of this stuff you should think of as frogs raining into your car, because it's simply not true. All right, so one of the reasons that people who want to become authoritarians use lies is because they weaken people. If half of you are out there running to your back door to see if there's frogs in your car, you're going to have less energy to come back and deal with something else. And so you're going to see a lot of this misdirection and a lot of this, you got to run here, you got to run there, you got to run here. Don't fall for it. It is designed to sap your strength. Let them say whatever they want to say, push back on it to the degree you can, but you do not have to get emotionally involved in a lot of this stuff. All right, that's my backdrop for telling you about executive orders. Executive orders are actually really cool. And you know, I like the whole structure of the American government. And if you think about the way that the framers of the Constitution wrote the American government, it's very theoretical in a lot of ways. They set up this system, they even called it a machine, but it was not clear in the early days where human beings fit into that. I mean, they said, well, the executive should do this. But like, even when it came time to make decisions, President Washington didn't know who his advisors should be. You know, he didn't know if he should talk to the Senate, or if he should have a cabinet, or if he should talk to the vice president whom he didn't like, or if he should, I don't know, draw straws from a hat. So there's a lot of places where it's not clear where in the Constitution where people come in. And that's one of the great innovations of the 1820s, is that with the arrival of political parties, people got inserted into the way the government works. But the reason I gave you that backdrop is because Washington figured out very quickly that he had to tell people what to do. You couldn't just turn to your staff and say, read the Constitution and then, make this happen. He had to say to people what should happen. And so he would tell them what to do. Now, every president since Washington has done this. And the way to think about an executive order, as they become known during the Lincoln administration, because that's when they're like, crap, somebody ought to make a record of these, because they've been happening all along, and we really actually kind of need to bring some order to it. And so our first official executive order happens during the Lincoln administration, but they've been there since Washington. The way I think of them is, it's like your boss. And whatever job you have, you've had a number of different bosses. And the rules of your institution are usually pretty much the same. But how they are implemented will depend on which boss you have. So a boss leaves, comes in, changes things, and tells you to do something differently than the previous person did, and then the next person changes as well. That's what an executive order is. An executive order says, this is what we're going to do under my direction. I'm your boss. This is what I'm going to tell you to do. All right. That's a really different thing than a law, and it's a really different thing than the Constitution, okay? So what you saw last night and what you have seen leading up to the inauguration was the promise on the part of Donald Trump and his cronies that he would have this blizzard of executive orders. And he did. I think there were 78 or so. I don't remember now. And they sound absolutely terrifying. And you've read about a lot of them. Gonna get rid of all our nonpartisan civil servants and replace them with loyalists, and a whole bunch of and I'm going to talk about birthright citizenship and all these different executive orders. But if you actually read them, and I didn't read all of them last night, I read a lot of them. A lot of them are like saying there are frogs raining in the back of your car. So one of them, for example, which got cheers at the Capital One Center arena, Capital One Arena, was that he was going to order his people, the people in his administration, to find ways to lower prices. That's an executive order? The problem with finding ways to lower prices is that the way you lower prices is you break up monopolies, which is what the Biden administration was doing and the Trump administration does not want to do. So you increase competition, or you decrease demand. And usually when you have decreased demand, it means the economy is in trouble. The bottom line is that prices don't come down. They can stop going up so quickly, but they don't come down unless you manage to have a glut of something. But it's hard to imagine what we're going to have a glut of that people want, because the obvious thing that people look at is gasoline, and that there's already a glut of. So that was in one of his executive orders. It's like, okay, to lower prices. That was just, I'm speechless. If my boss came in and said, I don't know, don't teach badly. Yeah, like, I'm sorry, but here in Maine, we would call that no shit Sherlock, right? So a lot of the executive orders were window dressing for his supporters. They were things like that. Others were really badly written, to the point that one person was like, this is just posturing. There's no there. And so a lot of that, they kept talking about shock and awe, and we were all going to be terrified, and and he was going to come in and do all this stuff. Well, if that's the best they can do for shock and awe, we're in a much better position than I expected to be. I'll be honest, I was very concerned. I won't tell you what I was concerned about. What I was concerned about didn't materialize. Instead, what we got were a demonstration that he was going to change the direction of the government, and he was going to do so with these sweeping demands. Now, so what does that mean? Again, remember, I just said that an executive order does not override a law. And that's really important. Remember, I talked the other day about it. It's the Congress that writes laws. They're the legislative branch. That's their job. They write the laws. And then those laws go to the president. And the president can either veto them and say, no, I'm not doing this, in which case the Congress can rewrite the law in a way that it makes the president happy, and then the president signs it. Or it can override a veto by getting 2/3 of the members of Congress to override when the president says no, or it can simply say, oopsie poopsie, we're done, we're not going to do this. So those laws exist, and nobody can write an executive order that says ignore a law, or I'm going to change the way you interpret this law. That's really not a thing. There's a subset of that I'm not going to tell you about right now, because in the scheme of things today, it doesn't matter. But what he is trying to do is put down markers that say, this is something I'm allowed to do. But already we are seeing significant legal challenges to 3 of the executive orders. And unfortunately, right now, off the top of my head, I can only remember 2. One is getting rid of the, I can't believe I can't think of the third, because it's the first one that happened. I'll come up with it in a second. It happened. Oh, I know what it is. There are 3 of them. So the first one that happened just as Trump was sworn in, they filed it, I think, within minutes, was a challenge to the Department of Government Efficiency that is run by Elon Musk, no longer by Vivek Ramaswamy, who left today, pushed out by Musk. And I think that's really interesting that he got pushed out by Musk, because there is clearly, as I've said before, a fight for control of the presidency. I'll tell you more about that in a second. And Elon Musk cannot become president unless we change the Constitution, but Vivek Ramaswamy could have. And pretty clearly, Musk has pushed him out, pushed him back to Ohio, where he says he wants to run for governor. He has no electoral experience at all. And this business of plucking people out and putting them in the highest offices in the land, I think is deeply problematic. But there we are. So there was a challenge immediately to the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE as I call it, because it has not been adhering to any sort of the federal laws about how you run an agency. And it wasn't an agency, of course, officially, until Trump tried to make it one last night with an executive order. That is already being challenged in court. But that's not the only one. The other one that is being challenged in court are the orders about, already, we're on day one of this administration. And not just by, grandma down the street challenging. There's a whole bunch of attorneys general and big interested parties challenging those. They're challenging his orders about the executive workforce. That's also there. But the biggie, of course, is his challenge to birthright citizenship, and that's in the 14th Amendment. So you asked about that. Let me tell you more about that. And that is, the 14th Amendment is my favorite amendment, as you know. Everybody should have a favorite amendment, just like everybody should have a favorite poem, and everybody should have a favorite Bible verse or Old Testament verse or whatever. I don't know, I just use those sometimes in my life. But the 14th Amendment is a really important amendment, and I've talked about the 14th before in a different context, and that is that it is the 14th Amendment, and the reason it's my favorite is because until the 14th, until the 13th, but with the 14th Amendment, until then, till 1868, when the 14th Amendment is ratified, it's written in 66, and that matters, but when it's ratified in 68, it guarantees that the federal government will make sure that the states treat everybody equally. So you have the protection of the federal government of its citizens from discrimination in state law. And you can see why this is something that the Republican Party, since the 1980s, really has been trying to overturn, to get rid of, because that concept, because they want the states to be able to discriminate based on religion, based on sex, based on race, based on ethnicity, and now apparently based on ideology too. And that you can't do because of the 14th Amendment. It was deliberately written to guarantee that the states, in this case the southern states is what they were really worried about, could not write laws that discriminated against Black Americans. But it's been expanded since then to say you can't discriminate against women, you can't discriminate against gender minorities, you can't discriminate against religious groups, and so on. That's what the 14th Amendment does. But the 14th Amendment, and the reason it's on the table in this birthright citizenship thing, is that it was a problem in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. Who was a citizen, and what were you a citizen of? And this, it seems crazy to us now, but citizenship in the early America was not all that clear. Like, who was a citizen? Most people had come from other places, except a lot of the indigenous Americans who were there, but they didn't adhere to the federal government. So who was a citizen? And that was not clear. And the whole study of how you declared your citizenship and how you became a citizen is really interesting in that period. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a rabbit hole here because I think it's so cool. You know who did manage to leverage federal citizenship in this early period? Is Black sailors. So the American maritime industry was never segregated, in part because, remember, if you forget cars and you forget railroads, everything is done by water. And when everything is done by water, that means people are in and out of each other's ports all the time. So here on the coast of Maine, for example, it was not unusual to see kopecks, for example, in the early 19th century, or not so much money from China, but there was always stuff circulating around and people circulating around. My great-great-great-grandfather was a cabin boy from Germany, because he was on board a ship that belonged to my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and then he married his daughter. Louis Frank married Gideon Yates's daughter. And that's my ancestor. They were my ancestors. So these people are always coming and going. And among them are black sailors, because the black sailors are really central to the maritime trades in the American South. And if you think of the coastline in America, we've got the coastline trades all along, but especially out of North Carolina, we have the turpentine trade, for example, and we have the mast trade. And then, of course, we have the goods that trade up and down the coast. So you've got black sailors going up and down the coast all the time. And white sailors, of course, going up and down the coast all the time. But what happens if you are a shipmaster and you're going to send your free black pilot, which is somebody really important on board ship, to the South? You don't want to have him get taken off and turned and sold, because he's important to your business. And what about if you're going to send him to Europe? Like how, or you're going to have a black person from Algiers who's on your crew. What are you going to do about that? Well, if you're a black sailor in those circumstances, you want papers. You want to be able to prove that you are free and that you're an American citizen. So you know what they start to do? I'm sorry, this is such a rabbit hole, but I think it's so cool. They start to write to the federal government and say, my name is Albert Jones. I'm making this up. And I'm, here's who I am, here's what I look like, because they don't have photographs. They don't have photographs. So they describe what they look like, and the federal government would give them papers saying they were citizens of the United States. Isn't that cool? All right, so then just as an even deeper rabbit hole, that's how a number of people who work in the maritime trades before the Civil War escape from enslavement, is they get friends who have those certificates to give them the certificate, because they don't have photographs and they look enough like the description that they think they can pass, and that's how they get out of the American South. Anyway, that was a huge rabbit hole, but isn't that cool? All right, so someday I'd love to write a book on the maritime trades. Anyway, so before the war, it's not clear at all who, and because it's complicated. You got a huge bunch of people coming into America in the 1840s and the 1850s from Ireland and from Germany. Lots of people. But are they state citizens? Well, yeah, sometimes states give them citizenship, but is there even any such thing as federal citizenship? There's almost nobody except these sailors who get federal citizenship. Not because you're denied it, but because nobody's put it together yet. So what happens is that after the Civil War, when the Republicans in Congress go to write this 14th Amendment, because Andrew Johnson has tried to just say, we're basically going back to the time before the Civil War, and black Americans are going to be serfs, essentially. I paraphrase, I promise you. I could do a better job with that, but I won't. The Republican Congress says, no, we're not going to put up with that. We're going to protect these people. How? How do you tell the states they can't do that? How do you identify against whom they can discriminate and not? And they say, we're just going to say, if you're a citizen of the United States, they can't pull crap on you. That's easy. But wait, who's a citizen? And what they do is they write a law, and it's a law, Civil Rights Act of 1866. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, they say anybody who is born here on this soil or naturalized, that is like in Massachusetts where Irish Americans had been naturalized by the state of Massachusetts. Naturalized means become a citizen. Anybody who's born here or naturalized here, except Indians not taxed, and there's a reason for that, I can explain to you in a minute, except Indians not taxed, and that's important, is a citizen of the United States. And they send this law off to Andrew Johnson, this president who is a former Democrat, and he is still a Democrat actually, and he doesn't believe in black rights. And he vetoes it. Remember I just told you about vetoes. He vetoes it and he says, what are you talking about? You know, we're supposed to be thinking about white Americans, first of all, white American men, but even if we're thinking about black Americans, if you put this into law, you're saying you want Fiji Islanders. He had this thing about Fiji Islanders. Actually, a lot of people did in that period. If you've read Moby Dick, you know there's a whole thing about in there about Fiji Islanders. You want Fiji Islanders to be American citizens? Of course not. Surely you didn't mean to do this. And he sends it back to them. And Congress turns around and they write the 14th Amendment. And what do they put in? The exact same language that he had said about the 1866 law was going to do these horrible things by letting all these people in, you know? So in the 14th Amendment, we have this language that the Congress basically said, yeah, we mean Fiji Islanders and everybody else as well. Now, it gets a little complicated in the period after 1868 when it's ratified by the states and added to the U.S. Constitution, because a number of states don't honor it for Chinese Americans and later on other Asian American groups, because they say that under the naturalization laws of the late 1700s, that you cannot be a citizen unless you are free and white. There's free and white, and they say that that Asians are not white, and so and a number of them until the late 1870s are not free either in the way that they're defining it. So it's a little hazy on Asian Americans in the American West, and that gets, including actually Pacific Islanders, and that gets a little fuzzy. But that idea that if you are born in America, you are a citizen is there from the beginning. So what happens is that it's, like I say, it's fuzzy in the West. Nobody really pushes it. And then in 1882, the Congress passes a law that excludes Chinese laborers from America. They still let in scholars and they still let in diplomats, but they exclude Chinese workers. And at the end of the 19th century, there's this guy, Wong Kim Ark, who goes back and forth between China. And on one of his trips back to America, and he was born here, they say you can't come into this country because you're Chinese. And he sues, and the Supreme Court says in 1898, no, he was born in America. If he was born in America, even at a time when people were freaking out about Chinese Americans, we have birthright citizenship. If you are born here, you have the right to be here. And one of the other pieces of that is that the courts also decided that their presumption was always that they would do whatever it took to protect the citizens who lived here. So if a citizen had a parent who was not a citizen, they would keep the parent so it would protect the citizen, because our interest was in the citizens. All right, that was way more than you probably wanted to know. But I gave you that whole thing because there's really no doubt that birthright citizenship was intended to mean people who were born here. Now, it didn't necessarily mean women. That's another story. But that they were intended to be here. That they were intended to be citizens if they were born here. And so what Trump did in this, I'm sorry, I got all excited about history now, and I realized I really didn't quite get the section right in the 14th Amendment, but I love our history. Anyway, what Trump did in this executive order was basically threefold. One of the pieces of the executive order is virtually explicitly aimed at Kamala Harris. He wants to have her declared not to be a citizen. And it's just nasty. I mean, it's stupid and it's nasty. Literally defining, figuring out who her parents were and saying this particular combination can't be a citizen, which is stupid and it's nasty. But he is also trying to reinforce the idea that the United States is going to be a white nation. And if you think about trying to get rid of people who were born here that don't have birthright citizenship, think of the mess that that's going to entail. It's really not a workable plan. But what he's signaling and saying is that we don't want anybody else here in this country. We want just to be us here in this country, and us is white men for the most part, ordering everybody else around. And that is just, to me, so interesting when you compare it to the era in which the 14th and Wong Kim Ark, the decision Wong Kim Ark was made, when Americans welcomed immigrants. Now, they discriminated against them and so on, but there was this idea that we needed people, and people would produce more than they could consume, and they would help the economy grow, and that America was a land of immigrants. This is when we get that concept of the melting pot. This is when we get, sort of the beginning of the lionization of the different ideas about Italian Americans or Slavs or Jewish Americans, people who were coming together to create this new nation. And to take that moment and 100 years later, more than 100 years later, have this man say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We don't want to grow. We want to go back to some imaginary past. And I think he lives in an imaginary past. Is just a really very indicative, I think, of where we are. But here's the kicker to all that. The reason he's doing this and the reason he's doing it the way he is because he wants to go to the Supreme Court. And he wants this Supreme Court, which he considers his own, to give him the power to rewrite the American Constitution. That's huge. That's a really big deal. And that's why people, a whole slew of people, are already suing over this executive order about the 14th Amendment. I realize I look like I'm in a hostage situation, so I'm going to turn on a light. It's very dark here. Hang on a second. All right, so that's what's going on with those executive orders. But let me now cover some more of the things that I think you need to hear right now. First of all, that's sort of the package that people, it seems to me, are afraid of right now. And they are concerned as well, I think, about the pardons of the January 6th insurrectionists. And you should be concerned about that, because that too was sending a signal. It was sending a signal that Trump wants people to fight for him in the streets and that he will protect them when that happens. And it was a signal of his utter disdain for our judicial system. Those things are very important, and that's something else to be concerned about. Now, but if that's the package of things we're concerned about right now, and there are a few more as well. Now let me tell you the good stuff from my side, why I am less concerned than I expected to be. The first of these is, let's start with the obvious place. Trump is in this at this point for money and power. And he's going to do anything it takes to get those things. So we've got this crypto coin, for example. That's important. Hang on to the idea that he has just walked away on paper with $60 billion created out of thin air by people who want to buy his favor. But that's important because you're hearing all this stuff now about tariffs, about how he's going to put all these tariffs in place on February 1st. Maybe. Who knows what's going to happen in the future? I'm watching those, assuming that what he is doing is he's saying to big companies, I'm going to slap a tariff on your product unless you pay me. Pony up some cash here, and then maybe we'll talk about whether or not your particular product is going to be in trouble. Because our trading partners, especially Canada and Mexico, are huge. And if, in fact, he slaps these tariffs on he's talking about, everybody is going to get really badly hurt. And in industries you can't even imagine, like a lot of the gaming components for gamers. I mean, I'm not a gamer, but a lot of those components come from Mexico. And if you read the gaming magazines, they're already unhappy about that. So he might do it just because he thinks he can do anything. But I think a lot of what you're going to see is him threatening people so they cough up money. And you saw this and they give him a piece of things. And you saw this, I think, in the fight over TikTok, where, basically he was acting there as Vladimir Putin. Give me half your business so I can use it the way I want and everything's going to be fine. So keep your eye out for threats that are threats that somebody could make money off of. And when that happens, recognize that maybe there aren't frogs raining in your car. This is him just shaking down another country or a business. So Oh, a couple more things that somebody just asked here. One of the executive orders takes us out of the WHO, the World Health Organization. Last time he tried to do that, it was challenged in court and he lost. We'll see if that happens again. Biden came in and reestablished a strong connection there. These are places that I'll talk about in a minute, but so there's that. So first of all, that's what I think is going on with tariffs. He's always looking for more money and more ways to make money. But here's a big thing that people aren't talking enough about. Did you listen to his speeches yesterday? Not the monotone inaugural address he read, which was a bizarre inaugural address. It was not at all, it was just bizarre. It was basically a toned down rally, which is not what an inaugural address is supposed to do. But the next one, the one he gave in the adjoining room, it was bonkers. I mean, it was like bonkers. And then the thing he did in the Capital One Arena, he's not okay. He is mentally not okay. He is rapidly deteriorating. And I think people know that. My own suspicion is that he didn't want to hold an outside rally because a lot of people didn't want a lot of others to see him, and he wanted to be in the Capitol Rotunda. I told you yesterday that I was there on Friday night, and Washington was empty. It was before he'd made the announcement, but Washington was absolutely empty. So it looked to me like nobody had made any plans to actually have people there, although the streets were all closed off. So he's not okay. And that's going to matter. And it matters in a number of ways. It matters because you don't want to have the most powerful person in the world mentally deteriorating. That's not a good thing. But it also matters because, and I keep saying this, there's a lot of power sloshing around in Washington, D.C. He is not coming in knowing what he's doing. He's not coming in with a strong team. He's coming in with some real what's the word in a like in a horse race, when you put weight on the horse, a handicap. He's coming in, whatever it is, when you put weights on a horse, he's not coming in at his best. We'll put it that way. All right, I'm a writer, not a speaker. All right, so he's not okay, first of all, and he's way overconfident. Like, he thinks he has come from nowhere. He thinks God has chosen him, and everything's going to be just roses from now on. And the first thing he did on his first day was terrible overreach. So, for example, the pardoning of the January 6th rioters was not popular in the United States of America. I think it was about 30% of Americans who were willing to go along with that idea. 70% of Americans did not want them pardoned. And I think the number of people who thought the violent one should be pardoned was even lower. I mean, it was really, really low, including Republicans, including Republican lawmakers, and including J.D. Vance, who said, of course, he should not pardon the violent rioters, and of course he won't do that. And he did. And the reaction has been just as extreme as you would expect it to be. His people, the Proud Boys marching in the streets going, whose streets? Our streets, and the QAnon shaman going, I'm going to go buy some expletive guns, and that's not going to play well in the places where people kept telling themselves that he didn't mean the stuff he was saying. How many times did you hear that? He's not really going to do that. He doesn't mean that. Oh, he's just talking. He's not going to do that. He's doing it. And that is a big problem for his presidency, because again, he keeps talking about how he's got a mandate. He's got talking about how he's got this landslide. He did not. More people voted for somebody else than voted for him, and he's got squeaky small majorities in the House and in the Senate. And what has he done right now? He's already pissed off a ton of people, including Lisa Murkowski, by saying he's going to rename Denali to Mount McKinley. And one of her strongest bases is among indigenous Alaskan populations. And she's like, what are you doing here? Like, you can't do this. No one cares. You're the only, enough about it. People do care his name, but Denali, who wants it to be called McKinley again? I could tell you the history of that, but McKinley was never an important, I mean, a beloved name. He was famous in 1917, and Woodrow Wilson named the mountain after him because he had gotten a little bit of a cult following after he was assassinated. But, like, did you know who McKinley was until Trump started talking about him? I did, but that's because of what I study. So he has way overreached with those pardons. But also with the firings and the, things like taking down Mark Milley's portrait. Milley is a really popular character in the military and elsewhere. With the firing today of the first female uniformed head of an armed services branch, that sort of thing is what one does if one is changing the country the way LBJ, for example, Lyndon Baines Johnson, after 1964, had a true mandate. He had 2/3 of Congress. That's a mandate. 2 votes is not a mandate. And so you've got this man who is mentally weak, older, mentally, he's 78 years old. And he's already terribly overreaching. And that brings up another place. Well, Ohio is a McKinley monument because McKinley was from Ohio. So and he was actually quite a well-known representative. I thought he was a terrible representative, but as a president, I mean, he was kind of a non-entity. I could tell you, well, never mind. All right. So what does this mean? And this maybe picks up another question that you asked. What you really all asked me to do is talk about what one does in this moment. And this, I think, is a really good transition to that. A lot of people always ask me to put calls to action in the letters I write every night. That is not what their mission is. They are trying to keep a record of what is happening, not what's going to happen or how to change what's going to happen, but what is happening, because I'm a historian and I want to leave a record for the present, for the future as well as the present. But I'm happy to talk about what to do here, because one of the things that I started to see after Trump got elected and that really took off yesterday was people sort of throwing their hands up and going, oh my God, democracy is over. And I'm not saying democracy is in great shape, let me tell you. But yesterday, with the fact that Trump looked so bad, has overreached so badly, and has shown that his people are largely incompetent, not only with the executive orders, but also with the simply mind-blowing fact that they did not have a defense secretary in place. I cannot emphasize enough to you what a big deal that is, that when Biden's people left office, Trump had not set up anybody to be the Secretary of Defense, the acting Secretary of Defense. That is inexcusable. There is nothing more important that a government does than defend its country. That is literally, think about, people with sticks. The first thing you do, you defend your country. Nothing, especially in a transition moment, is more important than a Secretary of Defense. Because when you have a transition, a country is weaker than when everybody's in harness. And they didn't have anybody. How do you not have a Secretary of Defense? I mean, how do you not have a Secretary of Defense? I was beside myself because, of course, Hegseth has huge problems. He is the Fox News Channel weekend host, or the former Fox News Channel weekend host, because he has problems with having run 2 businesses into the ground, and there's sexual assault stories about him, and he's has demonstrated a drinking problem, and it's going to be hard to get him through. But what one does is one has an acting Secretary of Defense, an acting secretary for these transitional moments. They didn't have one. And then it got worse. It turned out that 2 people had turned them down, which doesn't surprise me. I would turn down that job too, because you don't want to be the one holding the bag, theoretically. But in order to be in that position, you have to be somebody who's already been sworn into something by the Senate. So they got this guy who's a way down tier to say, yeah, I'll be the acting defense secretary. And you're thinking, really? This is the best you can do for the United States of America and a Defense Department that has over $800 billion running it and almost 3 million people. Is you tapped some guy at his desk and said, "Hey, dude, how do you feel about being the acting Secretary of Defense?" Mind you, I'm sure he's great at his job, but really, that's not a good sign for a competent administration. So with these things going on, what would I do? First of all, is stop despairing. These people are trying to convince you that there are frogs raining in your car. They look like the Keystone Cops. And yes, they wield enormous power. And yes, it is frightening what they can do. And yes, people are already getting hurt. Like they canceled the CPB-1 app that enabled people to make appointments to talk to border officers to apply for asylum in the United States. People are already getting hurt and will get hurt. All those things are true. But this is not a juggernaut. So what would I do? First of all, stop despairing. Stop saying it's all over. It is not all over. And two, don't shut up. Somebody asked, this is the Democrats' fault because Biden and Garland could and should have stopped him. And why didn't they? And here's my answer to that. I'll give you specifics, but then I'll give you a bigger answer. The specifics are, I am an agnostic on whether Garland should and could have moved faster. I am not a lawyer. It felt pokey to me as well, but I'm not a lawyer. But if you read Jack Smith's report, he's very clear that, in fact, Garland had been pushing hard all along against Trump and against the people in Trump's orbit. But they threw sand in the gears every step of the way. And of course, the real group who threw sand in the gears was the Supreme Court, which very clearly is working on Trump's behalf. And if you remember, the case of the January 6th insurrection was supposed to go forward in May of 2024. Trump said, "I have immunity." Jack Smith went to the Supreme Court and said, "Please decide this right now because every precedent says you're going to throw this out." They refused. If you remember, they wanted to hear the whole thing, and then they handed down the decision on the last possible day. They ate up all of 2024. So that is, I'm agnostic, and it's not a fight I'm willing to have either way. Go at it if you want to, because to me, it's like I was never about thinking that Garland was going to save us. I was thinking that's not my field. If they're doing their thing, that's great. I'm doing something else. But I think what Biden did is Biden always assumed that if he governed really well, if he made America strong internationally again and healed the badly hurting economy, which had moved so much money upward for 40 years, that people would be relieved. They didn't want to see the president on TV all the time. That was exhausting. We were tired by that they would reward the Democrats for being competent and for delivering, for actually doing stuff. But what I think he didn't realize, and mind you, I think this is true in foreign affairs as well as domestically, and that's a deeper story that I won't go into, but I think what they didn't ever recognize was that Donald Trump and his MAGA Republicans, for the first time in our history, refused to go away. Remember, presidents went away. That was always the deal. You didn't interfere with the next presidency. And Obama did that. When Trump was elected, he said, "I'm going to let him do his thing." Trump never did that. Trump was in people's faces all the time screaming. And the media rewarded him. The media gave MAGA Republicans and Trump this huge megaphone that criticized the Biden administration for sure, but that also drowned out virtually everything it had done. I mean, I did that list the other day of the things that the Federal Trade Commission did in its last week, and it was one of the most popular letters I've ever written, which really shocked me. But that got no traction during the administration. All the things that really mattered to people, the junk fees and all that, basically, unless you were reading me, you didn't have a chance of knowing that. And I would mention it, one paragraph a week or something. I did try to do one economic post a week. I don't know if you noticed that, but he just sucked up so much oxygen that he became, in a way, the shadow government. And that, I said to someone the other day, it's rather as if Abraham Lincoln was trying to run the Civil War with the Confederacy still in the Congress, which is really what we had to deal with. Jim Jordan and all those people constantly screaming, lying to the media. So the reason I just gave you that setup, and I do think that was an oversight on the part of Biden, not an oversight really. I think they believed it would work. And it certainly has worked in the past. That was, as somebody said, many people said before the election, anybody with the kind of numbers that Biden had should be cruising to a landslide reelection. But nobody knew that that was what was going on. So the reason I gave you all that there is because if you're wondering what to do next, that's our model. I think Americans have now, who are trying to defend democracy, recognize that the message, the yelling, and I don't literally mean yelling, but taking up oxygen is the way you push back against the MAGA Republicans who do not have a majority. Remember, 70% of Americans did not want the January 6th protesters to be pardoned. 65% of Americans want Roe v. Wade codified into law. More than 80% of Americans want common sense gun safety legislation. I could go down the list here. All the things that I believe in that we now call progressive, but once upon a time were actually Republican values, are extremely popular. So what do you do in this moment? First of all, don't despair. Second of all, do not shut up. And what I mean by that is that, for example, the pardoning of these J6 rioters is really unpopular. Talk about it. Complain about it. Write to your senators. Write to your local newspapers. Keep it front and center all the time, the same way that the Trump people took the exodus from Afghanistan and shoved it down Biden's throat, even though, of course, Trump had set that up. That's what we need to do, is take each one of these things and shove it down their throats. Do not shut up about it. Be aggressive about it. Call people out about it. Do you want the QAnon shaman, Jacob Chansley, do you want him out there buying, excuse me, I'm not going to say the word, it'll probably bleep me, expletive guns? Hammer that all the time. Hammer that stuff. Keep it front and center. Do not let that go, because that's what's going to grab headlines, and that's what's going to get attention. So that's going to be really important, because I think that people like me anyway have a tendency to say that happened, we'll move on. Don't move on. Hammer that stuff again and again and again and again. And you see this with Trump. So he's talking about Russia, Russia, Russia. You know what? That was true. He did get help by Russia. That's been proven, right, all across the board, but he has convinced his supporters that it's not true by keeping it front and center all the time. Repeat, 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 repeat. And that is, that's what somebody said, is that's why Trump won. He kept repeating things. They were lies, but he kept repeating them. We can repeat the truth again and again and again, and do not let it go. All right, so if that's the case, what does that look like? First of all, it's great to complain to me, as people do. Complain outward looking. I'm only one voice. Don't yell at me about something. For every time you want to yell at me, write 2 postcards to somebody who can make a difference. Call senators, call your representatives. And also, and here's a biggie, get involved at the local level. So in a number of states, there are real fights going on. North Carolina is a big one right now. Michigan, Ohio, Florida, Texas. Those are places where a little bit of pressure goes a long way. And people need your voices, really need your voices there. Where, no, you're not going to win everything in North Carolina tomorrow. But if we protect Allison Riggs's victory in the state Supreme Court race, and then get another Democrat elected in 2026, I forget what year we're in. I don't even know what year we're in. I think it's 2026. Then the gerrymandering in 2030 will be balanced again, and North Carolina will once again be the purple state that it ought to be. It's about 50-50, but right now the Republicans hold, I think it's 10 out of the 14 electoral seats there because of gerrymandering. Well, it's not fair. It should be 7-7, right? So get involved at the local level, first of all. Second of all, at the local level and at the state level. And that is going to make a huge difference. But here's another big piece. One of the things that really made it possible for Trump to win, you'll notice the down ballot races, the Republicans did not do well, but that enabled Trump to win was the right wing created an ecosystem, a media ecosystem. And it wasn't just politics people. It was, somebody was saying how he's a weightlifter. And he listens to podcasts that are just about nutrition and weightlifting, but they would sneak in things like somebody would make a mistake and they would say something like, "Oh man, I pulled a Biden there." That kind of change in culture, that affects people. You want to support a media that reinforces democratic values. And that doesn't necessarily mean Democrats, by the way. That means democratic values. That means the rule of law. That means a rules-based international order. That means, non-discrimination. That means that means education. That means community. That means the things that create a world in which we value everybody in our society. And you want to support that kind of media, and you want to contribute to that kind of media. So one of the things we know from the last election is that if people lived in news deserts, that is where there was not local news, they went as much as 54 points for Donald Trump. If you are in a position to report on something that is happening in your community, do it. And it doesn't mean you have to have millions of followers. It means you have to have 2 followers, and they might help you. And it is now at this point free to start a newspaper on Substack if you wanted to, or on Facebook where people are, and start to report what's happening in your community, because that ecosystem died for a long time. Now it's very much coming back, but we need more and more and more voices there. And I know there's a lot of people out there who are really good at observing, who go to these meetings, who are good writers, former journalists, former teachers, people who just want to have a hand in, and you can do this. You can also work to create your own communities, and there are a number of places that are already set up to do this. I work often with Red Wine and Blue, which teaches you how to become what they call a troublemaker, put together organizations. And the reason that that's important is not only because they're organizing over local political issues to push back against people like Moms for Liberty, but also because you don't feel so alone. I know in a lot of these places you feel alone, like you're the only person there. And the truth is you're not, but nobody knows it. And there's all kinds of really cool animations where they show what happens if people know there are people who think like them versus ones who don't think there are people who think like them. And the truth is that a minority can control people who don't have groups who say, yeah, we all kind of think like this. Think about the United States of America and realize that more than 80% of us want common sense gun safety legislation. All of a sudden, if you think about your community, and mind you, it's not going to be evenly distributed all over the country, but in your community, out of 10 people, 8 of them want background checks. All of a sudden, you don't feel alone so much, but they think that they're all alone too. So find those squads. Now, the other thing that I would urge you to do is support media that is fact-based. It does not mean democratic, big D. It means small d democratic, but not necessarily big D democratic. Because you want to have different opinions. You want to say, hey, wait a minute, maybe there's something there. I'm a huge fan of the Bulwark, which is center-right. I'm not entirely sure they're huge fans of me, but I'm huge fans of them. And there are plenty of people that are more center / I would call the contrarian, which is brand new. I would call that dead center. And then there's center left, people like Brian Tyler Cohen. I hope I'm center, but some people think I'm center left. Other people think I'm center right, so maybe I am center. There are, Brian Tyler Cohen is one. Joyce White Vance is great for legal stuff. So is Harry Litman, who used to be at the LA Times. He's now writing for the Contrarian. I'm sorry, I keep doing that. Yeah, it is the Contrarian. I cannot get that name in my head. And I should probably come up with a list for all of you. But you can tell if these people are writing fact-based stuff in a number of ways. Do they use sources? And if they do use sources, what are those sources? So one of the things that I always read, but I'm put off by their headlines, is I read the Midas Network. They're very good, they're very smart, but their headlines really feel tabloidy to me. And if you read something that you think, oh my God, this is terrible, that place probably is misleading you. So make sure that wherever you are reading, you know that you're reading actual facts. And you should also know that there are a number of things out there that we know of in the business as pink slime. And that matters. They have names that look real. Sometimes they even have stolen the masthead from the Washington Post, for example, or something. And they're called pink slime because they're AI generated, and they're AI generated from right-wing websites. So I'm trying to think, somebody sent me one the other day that was really outrageous. It was about something that it said the Biden administration had done. And I don't now remember what it was. But if you actually read the article and then tried to trace back the sources, it traced, oh, I know what it was. It was something about, I don't remember. Whatever it was, it traced back to an opinion piece that somebody who was interested in the outcome had written for a very right-wing website. And it's like, this isn't news. This is the sliming. They call it pink slime because it's like what comes out of food tubes that is supposed to be nutritional, and it's really just poisonous. So be very aware that there's a lot of stuff out there that is pink slime. And I would also urge you to be aware that there is, if you read stuff, there's often a subtext to it. And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of places, and this is me, maybe I'm seeing it and it's not really there, there are a lot of places that are playing around with how they can tell you something without telling you something. So, and here's an example I'm going to use. Yesterday, you may or may not know that Elon Musk gave a Heil Hitler salute twice at the Capital One Arena. And there is no doubt in my mind that that's what he did. And I am skeptical of all that stuff. Usually stuff gets chalked. I always start with people screwed up. So for example, there's been a lot of stuff going on Instagram right now. And maybe it's nefarious, but more likely people have screwed up. That's always my first line of defense, that people have just screwed up. And then you wait a couple of days, if it's still there, then it's a real thing. Anyway, there's just no doubt that this is what he did. There's just no doubt that this is what he did. The Washington Post had a picture of it, that on the cover of the salute, and said something, and I'm paraphrasing, questions are raised about dubious hand salute. And that got really panned for being way too reluctant to name what it was. And I'm not sure. It's entirely possible, mind you, that what the Times was doing was saying, look at this. People are saying this isn't true. I mean, that he didn't do this, but look with your own eyes and see what you see. And I think there's going to be a lot of that going forward, where people don't declare their positions because they're worried about the president coming down with tariffs, for example, that would hurt somebody like Jeff Bezos. But they're trying to say it without saying it. One of the places you can see this is there is a person from, and I'm not going to identify this person for their safety, but there is a person from a country that is an authoritarian country who reads the news, straight up reads the news, as if it's kind of like a good news thing. Like, today, the administration killed, whatever. But, and lots of people are interpreting that as this person endorsing it. And maybe it is. It's not my culture. But certainly in classical history, that was a way to alert people to what was really going on without being censored. And so that's something to be watching for going forward, to trust your eyes and what you see rather than necessarily what the headlines are telling you. Because I think we're going to see some of that going on too. And I would also say to you that this new media is huge. It's building fast. Anybody's interested, as I say, in these new local newspapers, now is your moment, because these, all of a sudden, there's this explosion in fact-based newspapers. Great place if there's a young person watching me. It's a great place for you to start a journalism career. start right now at your school board meeting this afternoon, this evening. There is this new ecosystem happening. So what we need to do going forward is do not despair, do not shut up. Do not shut up. Turn that energy outward into the local area, into the state areas, and into the federal government. Places like write to your Republican senators or other people's Republican senators. Don't call other people's because they won't take your name because they only want to have their own constituents. But you can write to them saying, Pete Hegseth, really? Tulsi Gabbard, really? This is on your head. And if enough people do that, that will really change the way this administration goes forward. And don't tell me that's not true, because Matt Gaetz had to withdraw. And I'm not saying we're going to win everything, but we are going to win some. And the more we win, the winning becomes a habit, and so does losing. And now is the time really to lay down those markers. All right, so I'm still working on getting my act together over here to figure out how to do both YouTube and Facebook at the same time, and to do some other stuff while I'm writing the letters and so on. I really do work on these things, but there's only one of me, and it just takes a lot. It's a lot of moving pieces. So thank you for being here. Keep the faith. I will try and do these more often if you feel like they help. And I certainly will do more on YouTube. I've got a lot coming up there. And thank you for being here. And I will see you next week, if not before. Thanks for being here.